So the first thing that I'm going to start with actually is a dry brush technique. I'll show you that very quickly. It's kind of maybe what it sounds like, where you pick any color you want, but before you start to paint, you'll actually use your paper towel to dry it off, and maybe you get some more paint on and dry it off. And I just want you to test out how dry you can make your brush and what happens to it. So that's one technique that you'll try today. What happens when you blot off and use a dry brush. Now glazing is a little tricky. Glazing, you need some drying time in between. So I'm gonna just add one color. You can do any color you want. I'm doing purple, and I'm gonna go back and leave it. Now keep watching, don't do it yet. We'll go back to the purple for my glazing later. So all we've really done so far is dry brushing, which is hard to see. Now, here's my other one. I call it lift off, which is so silly. You can do lift off in 2 different ways. So number one, once you get the paint on there, you can use a paper towel to kind of lift off. And this is one of my favorite techniques for making clouds. Or the other way I love to lift off, especially if the paint gets kind of dry, is to rinse my brush off in my water. Get a nice clean brush and use my nice clean brush like an eraser. And sometimes I'll even go back into my clouds later and make them even whiter. And you could do a lot of things with a lift off. So that's another technique, is lifting off. Straw blowing. Make sure when you do straw blowing, you are using a clean straw. And after you're done, if you put your mouth on it, you can just throw it in the garbage. But straw blowing you have to be really gentle with. If you make a mess on the table, please make sure you clean it up and don't be silly about it. I would never do this with a class that I didn't think could handle it, so you guys can handle it. I'm putting a blob of paint on there, and in your head, I bet you know what's gonna happen next. You take the straw, and you're gonna blow it. So don't do anything yet, because I want you guys to take your time with these. And you go really gentle and play around with it. Sometimes I do little blobs down on the bottom. This is how I make a lot of my branches and coral and things.
We did this a couple of years ago to make trees.
You know, I could do this every day and it doesn't get old. So that's straw blowing. The next one is rubbing alcohol, it says, which is kind of silly. Pick any color you want again. And this rubbing alcohol I put in little containers. You'll have to share it. It's in these little containers. Please be very careful. You don't really want to drip it too much. And I know you guys do this in lunch. I'm going to use the same straw before I throw it away. And have you ever done this where you capture liquid in the end of it by putting your finger over the top? We're going to do that. So I'm gently putting the straw into the rubbing alcohol, and I'm going to seal it up with my finger. Do you see my finger sealing it? Lift it up, and you should have, if you don't move your finger, you should capture a little bit of rubbing alcohol. I actually have way too much, so I'm just going to put it on the top, get a tiny little dot, and then you're going to touch it and drop it to your paper, and the rubbing alcohol will do some really cool things. It reminds me of like outer space, but you guys get to see when it dries what it reminds you of. When you're all done with that, try to put the lid on it so it doesn't go everywhere. Now, we also yesterday had a spot where we did a flat